let's say with the Iran war, next guest says ending the war isn't entirely up to the United States or President Trump. Joining us now, Council on Foreign Relations President and former U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman. Michael, great to have you with us. I mean, it takes two to tango, and it all depends on what Iran does in response. The new leadership in Iran, I would dare to say, probably doesn't have any desire to negotiate with the U.S. on any level, considering he is a son of the former leader, and his entire family was basically killed by the United States in these strikes.
No, I think that's right. We have to expect that he's going to be another radical leader. And on the U.S. side, there are military objectives, there are political objectives to be achieved, and the president can decide when to declare victory with regard to those objectives. But as you said, it takes two to tango. In Iran, the enemy always has a vote in whether a conflict comes to an end or not. Iran can always decide to retaliate at the time and place and in the manner of its choosing. It's something we're going to have to be very much on guard about going forward.
There's a couple of flashpoints that you're watching, and one of them, Michael, is whether or not the U.S. decides to seize the enrichment program. And I'm wondering, are we going to – what are you watching for specifically?
So there's this 450 kilograms of enriched uranium, 60% enriched uranium, which is not necessarily enough to be put on a missile and sent, not enriched enough to that level, but it can still make several bombs that could be used against its neighbors, against Israel and others. And so if the president wants to make sure that Iran can never possess a nuclear weapon, we've got to deal with those 450 kilograms of enriched uranium. We don't know exactly where they all are, allegedly, and to get it out, it would probably take boots on the ground of some sort or another, whether it's special forces and other forces, something much more significant than we saw in Venezuela and something much more significant than we're seeing now in terms of not just attacks from the air, but attacks on the ground as well.
Michael, in the early days of the war, obviously just last week, there was a lot of talk of when Iran might be depleted in terms of its capacity to strike its neighbors, its drone fleet, things like that. Do we have any reliable reads on exactly what is left?
Certainly, the U.S. and Israeli strikes have greatly depleted their capability, as has their use of their arsenal. And attacks have gone down something like 90% from the first couple days of this phase of the conflict. But we don't have a very good sense yet of how much more they have left in their arsenal. They had thousands of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, and also, of course, drones. And we've shot down a lot. We've destroyed a lot of their capacity to build new missiles, but we don't have a very good sense yet of how close they're getting to actually running out.
From Iran's standpoint, Michael, do you think that they have seen sort of the threshold of pain that the administration is willing to endure in this conflict, seeing that the administration is already looking for ways to ease higher oil prices, which haven't, according to a lot of oil analysts, actually gone as high as maybe one would think, given what is going on in the Strait of Hormuz and what is going on with production being shut in?
As we've seen, the prices went up briefly up to almost $120. Now they're back down to about $90, which is still about a 45% increase over where they were at the beginning of the year, but down from the peak. And as you said, depending on what happens in the Strait of Hormuz, what happens with oil that actually gets shut in, which is hard to restart again, we could see higher oil prices there as well. In terms of the pain level, the president has made clear he wants to sort of get this done once and for all, and it will depend in large part on how much longer this takes and whether there are market reactions that put some sort of constraints on him. But as of now, he continues to be very focused on sinking their navy, making sure they don't have the capacity to protect a nuclear program, dealing with their missile and drones, and dealing with their proxies. And so those issues are still very much the focus of the military action.
And, Michael, quickly, you said Iran obviously has a vote as to whether this war ends. What about Israel? Is the U.S. and Israel aligned in terms of what the objectives are and when it might be accomplished?
I think they're not exactly overlapping in all of their objectives. I think, as the administration has laid out, and we had Bridge Colby here last week from the Pentagon, our objectives are to make sure Iran cannot exercise power outside of Iran through proxies, a nuclear program, a missile program, or its navy. Israel appears to have an additional set of objectives around regime change and perhaps destruction of the Iranian state. The U.S. wouldn't object necessarily to regime change. But it doesn't appear to be the primary objective of our military action versus Israel's.